Starting in 1902, a group of tenacious reporters and writers started exposing scandalous information. These reform writers, called muckrakers, targeted trusts, railroad barons, lobbyists, and social evils. They believed that the cure for democracy was more democracy and counted on public conscience, not political changes, to cleanse capitalism. The progressive movement was brought on by mostly urban middle-class citizens who felt trapped between the big trusts and big money above and the immigrant workers and wage workers below. Their goal was to use state power to curb trusts and stem the socialist threat by improving the common person's life and labor conditions. They also petitioned for the direct election of senators to stop corruption, which was fulfilled with the 17th Amendment in 1913. The role of women cannot be denied, as they contributed to the movement through settlement houses, women's clubs, campaigns for factory reforms, and temperance. In 1911, after the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire that killed 146 people, mostly young women, much stronger laws were passed regulating hours and conditions of sweatshops. President Theodore Roosevelt was a huge supporter of progressivism. His Square Deal embraced the 3 C's: control of corporation, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources. He was the first president to try to tame the extreme laissez-faire economics that had been devouring the country by keeping the good trusts and busting the bad trusts. After 2 terms in office, Roosevelt's hand-picked successor, Taft, stepped in, but his extreme trust-busting policies drove a wedge between the former president and the president, so much so that Roosevelt decided to run for a 3rd term in 1912. However, Taft still won the Republican nomination, so Roosevelt decided to run under what became known as the Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt and Taft ripped at each other's platforms, causing the Republican Party to split and allowing the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson to win, who had campaigned under a very anti-socialistic platform called New Freedom. Woodrow Wilson was very stubborn and unwilling to compromise if he thought he was right. He wanted to tackle the triple wall of privilege, which was the tariff, the banks, and the trusts. The Underwood Tariff of 1913 substantially reduced import fees and enacted a graduated income tax, as allowed by the recently passed 16th Amendment. In 1913, the Federal Reserve Act created the Federal Reserve Board, which oversaw a nationwide system of 12 regional reserve districts, each with its own central bank that could print money. It was essentially a third bank of the United States. In 1914, the Clayton Antitrust Act furthered the Sherman Antitrust Act. Thus, Wilson successfully tackled the triple wall of privilege. When World War I broke out in Europe, Wilson quickly issued a neutrality proclamation. However, America, unwillingly, was slowly drawn into the Great War. After German submarines consistently sunk American ships, Wilson forced Germany to agree to the Sussex Pledge, where Germany agreed not to sink passenger and merchant ships without warning, establishing a very precarious and unstable neutrality. In January of 1917, Germany broke the Sussex Pledge when it announced that it would wage unrestricted submarine warfare on all ships present in the war zone. The Zimmermann Note 2 months later further infuriated Americans, and on April 6, 1917, America declared war against Germany. Wilson preached that America entered the war to make the world safe for democracy. On January 8, 1918, Wilson delivered his 14 Points address to Congress, which was a set of idealistic goals for peace. Wilson's most treasured one was an international organization that would keep the peace and settle disputes. Although German Americans were very loyal to the U.S., the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act showed American paranoia about those who might be threats. During the war, laborers in factory, for the most part, dutifully resisted from striking to increase wartime production. However, the steel strike in 1919 was one glaring exception. 250,000 workers walked off their jobs, so the companies brought in 30,000 African Americans to break the strike, and naturally violence erupted. Throughout the war, women found numerous ways to be of help. So impressed was Wilson by the women's war effort that he endorsed women's suffrage, and in 1920 the 19th Amendment was ratified. The war officially ended in November of 1918. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, the Big Four, America, Britain, France, and Italy, dominated the negotiations. The Finnish Treaty of Versailles was scorned by many Republicans at home, who were upset that Wilson did not take any Republicans to the conference. The treaty was ultimately Wilson's downfall, and was spurned by the Senate along with Wilson's brainchild, the League of Nations. In 1920, Republican Warren G. Harding was elected president. After the war, America turned isolationist and denounced radical or un-American ideas. There was a resurgence of the KKK in the 1920s, who were anti-foreign, Catholic, black, communist, bootlegger, birth control, Jewish, so basically anything non-white and non-traditional. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 reflected America's new attitude when it restricted immigration to 3% of the people of their nationality who had been living in America in 1910. This was soon further restricted by the Immigration Act of 1924, which only allowed 2% of the population from 1890. The new act discriminated against Southern and Eastern Europeans who had not been very numerous in America during this time. Prohibition was law through the 1920s after the 18th Amendment. However, it largely failed because it was weakly enforced and hated by much of the nation. Many figured that if enough people broke it, the law would eventually be repealed. Massive gang wars were also provoked in cities like Chicago, as each tried to corner the new booze market. Despite all this, prosperity flourished during this age. New industries and machines became widely available, most significantly the automobile. The air age was also launched by the Wright brothers. The first solo west-to-east flight over the Atlantic was performed by Charles A. Lindbergh in 1927. The radio knitted the nation closely together. Millions could now listen to music, comedies, and politicians. The first talkie movie, The Jazz Singer, was shown in 1927. However, signs of a crash appeared in the midst of prosperity. Hundreds of banks failed annually, and there was a wild real estate speculation and stock exchange. Although President Warren G. Harding was a good man, he was a very weak and inept president, and unable to detect his scheming associates. Under his administration, Gilded Age-style politics made a small comeback, as corporations expanded again and antitrust laws were weakly enforced. The Five-Power Naval Treaty of 1922 and the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 lulled Americans into a false sense of security, who now believed future wars would be avoided. America's economy after the war boomed, while Europe was struggling to reconstruct itself. The Teapot Dome scandal rocked the Harding administration when it was exposed in 1923. The Secretary of Interior had leased naval oil sites to oilmen for huge bribes. There were also a few other more minor scandals as well. When Harding died in August of 1923, his VP, Calvin Coolidge, became president. Coolidge had only mediocre leadership abilities, but he was led by morality and was able to clear much of the graft of the Harding administration. Unraveling the debt knot in Europe became a huge issue, which was solved with the Dawes Plan in 1924. U.S. bankers loaned money to Germany to pay its debt to France and Britain to pay their debt to the U.S. After the crash in 1929, America continued to demand its payment from the Europeans, who were not able to pay, and therefore it left bitter feelings in all countries involved. The radio figured prominently for the first time in the 1928 presidential election of Herbert Hoover. The stock market crashed on October 29, 1929, when more than 16 billion stocks were sold and stockholders lost more than $40 billion. The Hawley-Smoot Tariff of 1930 raised duties to nearly 60%, angering foreigners and pushing America and other nations deeper into the Great Depression. At first, Hoover refused to do anything to combat the Depression, but soon it became clear that the welfare of the people was his main concern, so he settled for a trickle-down policy where he helped railroads, banks, and rural credit corporations, hoping that the wealth would spread. Franklin Delano Roosevelt sweepingly won the election of 1932 against Hoover. In the election, for the first time, blacks started voting democratically. FDR's New Deal was based on his 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. As soon as he was elected, he called Congress into a special 100-day session, where unprecedented numbers of legislation were passed. The Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act of 1933 provided for the federal Deposit Insurance Company, also known as FDIC, which insured individual deposits up to $5,000. With this legislation, banks started to reopen as people started to trust their money to banks again. FDR also took America off the gold standard in order to manage currency through inflation, which he believed would relieve debtors and stimulate production. The Dust Bowl in 1933, caused mostly by dry farming techniques and mechanization, only added to the depression. Many Okies and Arkies were forced to leave their farms. The Wagner Act in 1935 was a huge milestone for labor as it reasserted the right of labor to organize. By 1938, the New Deal was starting to lose its sparkle, and critics lamented the lavish government spending and turned towards socialism. The 1933 London Conference was a hope to develop a worldwide solution for the Great Depression. However, Roosevelt pulled out of it and therefore plunged the world deeper into economic crisis because the conference then collapsed. FDR slowly withdrew America from the Philippines, seeing that they had become a liability during the hard times. America also formally endorsed non-intervention in Latin America, bringing in the Good Neighbor policy. After World War I, America was not willing to become meddled in Europe's affairs again. Even though it disliked the European dictators, Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin, it refused to do anything. During the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, America refused to help Spain's democratic government against the fascist Francisco Franco, and thereby condemned the democracy to death. After England and France declared war on Germany, America at first declared complete neutrality. However, Roosevelt persuaded Congress to pass the Neutrality Act of 1939, which allowed European democracies to buy American war materials on a cash-and-carry basis. France fell to Germany in June of 1940, scaring and shocking America. Hitler then started bombing Britain by August of the same year, so America started to send ships to England under the slogan, "All aid short of war." However, this slogan was reversed when Japan struck at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. America officially declared war on December 11, 1941. Once America entered the war, it agreed with Britain to get Germany first and then attack Japan. National outrage at Japan was strong, and approximately 110,000 Japanese Americans living on the West Coast were herded into concentration camps, even though they had done nothing wrong. The war ended the Great Depression, but it also ended the New Deal, since the country's efforts were now on winning the war. Approximately 15 million men were enlisted to the war, although certain industrial and agricultural workers were exempted from the draft. Even so, an agreement with Mexico in 1942 brought in thousands of Mexican workers, called braceros, to harvest crops in the West in order to make up for the lost workers. More than 6 million women also took up jobs outside the home. The war prompted a huge exodus of blacks from the South and Native Americans from their reservations, who enlisted in the military or found war jobs in cities. When FDR died in April of 1945, the country was shaken. Roosevelt's VP, Truman, quickly took up command. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7, 1945. Japan's naval force was completely ruined by October of 1944, but it continued to hold and fight back. The Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, between Truman, Stalin, and British leaders, issued an ultimatum to Japan: either surrender or be destroyed. Because Japan did not surrender, America dropped the newly perfected atomic bomb, first on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and then 3 days later on Nagasaki. Japan by then had really no other choice but to surrender, and did so on August 10, 1945.